Jessica Turner had long since mastered the art of exhaustion. At 35, she balanced life like a tightrope walker without a net. 12-hour hospital shifts, 2 children with boundless needs, and a mortgage that loomed over her like a shadow. Each day bled into the next. Wake up, pack lunches, rush to work, collapse into bed, repeat. The house she bought 3 years ago, a modest 2-story with peeling paint and a sunburned lawn, was her only fortress against the chaos of the outside world. It was a blistering afternoon when the letter arrived. She had just come home from a night shift, her scrub stiff with hospital air, her eyelids heavy. Standing at the curb, she shuffled through the day's mail, junk flyers, a utility bill, and then a white envelope bearing the official seal of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. She sighed. The HOA was notorious for nitpicking, but usually their letters were nothing more than reminders about block parties or recycling schedules. She tore the flap and read. Her eyes skimmed the first line, then snapped back to the bold-faced words in the center. Notice of violation. Fine amount, $3,500. Cause, yard vegetation exceeding permitted height, 96 inches. Jessica froze, the paper trembling in her hands. $3,500 for grass? She dropped her bag on the porch and stumbled to the side yard. Sure enough, the corner near the back fence had gone wild. While she'd been drowning in overtime shifts, the grass had crept higher, tall weeds tangling in the summer heat. The tallest measured near 8 feet, a green tower that mocked her fatigue. But the patch was small, hidden from the street. Only someone deliberately searching would have noticed. Her stomach tightened. She couldn't even remember the last time she'd mowed. Between Lily's school projects, Ethan's soccer games, and the endless hours at St. Mary's Hospital, yard work had become an afterthought. She knew it looked unkempt, but a fine this steep? It wasn't just punishment. It was financial devastation. She carried the letter inside and set it on the counter, staring at the numbers as if they might shrink with enough willpower. The kitchen clock ticked loud in the silence. For Jessica, every dollar mattered. Her paycheck barely covered rent, food, and utilities. The smallest disruption could topple everything. This fine was more than a disruption. It was a wrecking ball aimed at her stability. That evening, while cooking spaghetti for dinner, she tried to hide her unease. But Ethan, at 12, had grown sharp-eyed, attuned to the tremors in his mother's voice. "Mom," he asked, setting the table with mismatched forks. "Did something happen?" Jessica forced a smile. "Just a letter from the HOA. Grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it bad?" he pressed. She hesitated. Lying to him felt wrong, but the truth was too heavy. "It's unfair. That's all." He nodded slowly, though his frown lingered. Lily, younger and blissfully distracted, twirled noodles on her fork without a care. Jessica envied that innocence, the bubble not yet punctured by the world's cruelties. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Jessica sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper, scrawling figures. Rent due in 2 weeks. Car insurance next month. Groceries, gas, utilities. No matter how she rearranged the numbers, the fine loomed like an immovable wall. Paying it meant falling behind on everything else. Ignoring it risked penalties she couldn't afford to imagine. Frustration surged. She had always played by the rules, paid her dues, shoveled her walk in winter, waved politely to neighbors. She wasn't some neglectful homeowner letting her property rot. She was a single mom barely surviving, and now the association that claimed to protect community standards was treating her like a criminal. She crumpled the pad and tossed it aside. Sleep offered no escape. Her dreams filled with towering weeds and faceless men in suits demanding money she didn't have. The next morning, under the gray dawn, she stood at the fence line again, staring at the offending patch. It was ugly, yes. Neglected, yes. But worth $3,500? The figure rattled in her chest. Jessica knew then that the letter wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning. Someone on that HOA board had decided to make an example of her.
Why?
Maybe because she was alone, without a husband to stand beside her at meetings. Maybe because she worked nights and wasn't around to attend every committee gathering. Or maybe it was simply because she was too tired to resist, and easy prey always made for the cleanest victory. But as she folded the letter back into its envelope, a spark of defiance flickered beneath her exhaustion. She might be tired. She might be broke. But she wasn't about to let anyone bully her out of her home. And if Oak Ridge's HOA wanted a war, they had just declared it. Jessica decided her first step would be to confront the fine directly. She rehearsed her words on the drive over, clutching the violation notice like a shield. The Oak Ridge Community Center, where the HOA board held its meetings, looked deceptively cheerful with its manicured flower beds and brick facade. Inside, though, the atmosphere felt more like a courtroom. The board members sat in a neat row behind a long table, their nameplates gleaming under fluorescent lights. At the center was Harold Whitman, the HOA president. Retired, wealthy, and perpetually stern, Harold was the type of man who ironed his polo shirts and expected everyone else to live up to his standards. His eyes flicked up as Jessica entered, assessing her with clinical detachment. "Miss Turner," he said, shuffling papers without offering a greeting. "You're here to discuss the vegetation violation?" "Yes," she answered, steadying her voice. "I wanted to request reconsideration. The fine is excessive. I admit I fell behind on yard maintenance, but $3,500 could bankrupt me. It's not proportional." Murmurs rippled among the other members. One elderly woman in a lavender scarf glanced at Jessica with sympathy, but no one spoke. Harold leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "The bylaws are explicit. Maximum vegetation height, 48 inches. Your property was documented at 96. The penalty is standard." His tone suggested finality, as though he had personally carved the rules in stone. Jessica's jaw tightened. "Standard for whom? I've seen plenty of houses with overgrown yards. None of them are being fined." Harold's lips curled into a thin smile. "Perhaps you're mistaken." The dismissal stung more than the words. Jessica gathered her papers and left, her chest tight with rage. She had come seeking fairness, but what she found was a wall of indifference, fortified by Harold's authority. The following week, a new envelope appeared in her mailbox. Another violation. This time for improperly parked vehicle. Her minivan, apparently, had overhung the driveway by a few inches. Fine, $150. 2 days later, another notice arrived. Trash bins visible from the street after collection day. Fine, $75. Jessica felt hunted. Every minor slip was cataloged, magnified, and weaponized against her. Meanwhile, her neighbors seemed immune. She watched Mr. Collins across the street leave his garbage cans out for days without consequence. She passed a corner lot where weeds stretched higher than her own, untouched by enforcement. The rules weren't being applied, they were being targeted. At night, Jessica pored over the HOA handbook, highlighting clauses, trying to make sense of the penalties. It was all there in black and white, but the language was vague, malleable. Unsightly conditions could mean anything. Improper parking was undefined. It gave the board, and by extension, Harold, almost unlimited discretion. The pressure mounted. Ethan noticed the change first. "Mom," he whispered one evening, "are we going to lose the house?" Jessica's throat tightened. She wanted to lie, to protect him, but the lien notice she had received that morning was still fresh in her mind. It warned that if fines went unpaid, the HOA could escalate to legal action. In extreme cases, even foreclosure. The thought of her children uprooted, forced into instability, was unbearable. She hugged him tightly. "We're not going anywhere," she promised. But the words felt fragile, like glass that might shatter with the next letter. One evening, returning from a late shift, Jessica saw Harold standing near her driveway, clipboard in hand. He was inspecting her property under the yellow glow of the streetlight, scribbling notes. Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, Jessica saw satisfaction flicker across his face, as if this was more than duty, as if it were personal. The realization chilled her. This wasn't about grass or bins or cars. Harold had chosen her. And he wouldn't stop until she broke. Still, Jessica refused to crumble. She began saving every notice, snapping photos of her yard, her car, her bins. She marked dates, times, and even her neighbors' violations that went ignored. Each scrap of evidence felt like armor. But Harold's campaign escalated faster than she could keep up. The fines piled high, her bank account drained lower, and the lien threat loomed larger. Alone at her kitchen table, surrounded by a fortress of letters and invoices, Jessica felt the weight of the battle pressing down. Something had to change. She could not fight Harold on his terms. She needed another path, another weapon. And as she stared at the growing stack of notices, the flicker of an idea began to form, small, fragile, but undeniable. This wasn't just harassment. It was a pattern. And patterns could be exposed. Jessica's dining table no longer looked like a place for family dinners. It had become a command center, stacked with envelopes, photographs, and handwritten notes. Every fine, every warning, every casual cruelty from the HOA had been cataloged. Where once she had felt powerless, she now felt the faint stirrings of control. She replayed recordings from the last HOA meeting, Harold's voice dripping with superiority as he dismissed her concerns. Each clip confirmed what she already knew. The rules weren't being enforced equally. Harold had turned regulations into weapons, choosing targets at his whim. But proving it required more than suspicion. Jessica began walking the neighborhood in the early mornings, when the streets were quiet and the dew still clung to the grass. She carried her phone like a detective's notebook, snapping discreet photos of violations, trash bins left out for days, lawns streaked with weeds, cars parked half on sidewalks. Every time-stamped image became another puzzle piece. What struck her most was the indifference. These neighbors faced no fines, no letters, no threats. The rules, so rigid when applied to her, seemed invisible for them. It wasn't long before she shared her findings with someone outside Oak Ridge. Late one night, desperate for guidance, Jessica stumbled upon an online forum for homeowners locked in battles with their HOAs. There she read story after story. Retirees fined for flower beds, families threatened over paint colors, veterans harassed for flagpoles. It was a litany of abuse, eerily familiar. One comment stopped her cold. Don't fight them in silence. Document everything, then go public. HOAs hate exposure more than anything else. The thought lodged in her mind like a seed. Exposure. The following week, Jessica reached out to a local journalist whose byline she had seen on stories about community disputes. She sent a cautious email, attaching a handful of her photos and describing the $3,500 fine. To her surprise, the reply came within hours. This sounds like something worth investigating.
Can we talk?
When they met at a quiet cafe downtown, Jessica laid her life bare. She spoke of the endless letters, the lopsided enforcement, the lien threat hanging over her children's future. The journalist listened intently, jotting notes, occasionally asking for clarification. By the end, he promised to dig deeper. "You're not the first person Harold has targeted," he said, lowering his voice. "I've heard whispers about Oak Ridge before. But your documentation, that's gold." Hope stirred in Jessica's chest for the first time in months. Still, she knew hope alone couldn't win battles. She needed allies inside the neighborhood, people who had also felt Harold's heavy hand. And so she knocked on doors, sometimes nervously, sometimes defiantly. At first, responses were cautious. Many homeowners had learned it was safer to comply than resist. But gradually, stories spilled out. Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow down the block, admitted she had been fined $500 because her roses clashed with community standards. The Harris family confessed they'd been threatened for leaving Halloween decorations up one day too long. Each testimony emboldened Jessica. She wasn't a lone victim. She was part of a pattern. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Jessica was no longer a solitary figure standing before the board. A half-dozen neighbors came with her, voices sharp, anger simmering. They demanded answers, demanded fairness. Harold tried to gavel the room into order, but the dissent refused to quiet. Then, midway through the heated exchange, the journalist walked in with a cameraman. The lens swept the room, capturing Harold's tight jaw, Jessica's stack of notices, and the rising fury of residents who had been silent too long. Harold's composure cracked. "This is a private meeting," he barked. "Correction," the journalist said evenly. "This is a community meeting, and the community deserves transparency." Jessica felt adrenaline surge. For the first time, Harold wasn't in control. His usual tactics, intimidation, dismissal, arrogance, sounded hollow when echoed on camera. Yet, as satisfying as the moment was, Jessica knew it was only the beginning. A single confrontation wouldn't topple Harold's empire of rules and fines. He still held the title, the bylaws, the machinery of power. But now she had something she had lacked before: visibility. And with it, momentum. That night, as she tucked Ethan and Lily into bed, Jessica allowed herself a rare smile. Ethan squeezed her hand. "You look strong today," he whispered. She kissed his forehead. "We're stronger than they think," she said. Still, when she returned downstairs and saw the newest envelope waiting on her counter, her smile faltered. Another violation, another fine, proof that Harold wasn't finished. Jessica stared at the unopened letter, the weight of it pressing into her chest. For all her progress, the battle was far from over, and the next move would decide everything. The news segment aired on a Tuesday evening, sandwiched between stories of city council debates and a summer heat wave. But it was Jessica's story that captured attention. The broadcast opened with footage of her yard, the offending 8-foot grass patch swaying in the wind, hardly the jungle of neglect Harold had implied. Then came the interviews, Jessica in her scrubs, speaking calmly about long shifts, raising children, and the impossible burden of a $3,500 fine. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared next, her voice trembling as she described being punished for her roses. Finally, the camera caught Harold outside the community center, snapping, "No comment," before slamming his car door. That clip played twice in the broadcast, once in slow motion, his scowl frozen on screen. By the following morning, the neighborhood buzzed. Phones lit up with texts, social media feeds churned with outrage, and residents who had once stayed silent began speaking openly. Neighbors stopped Jessica in the street to whisper support. Some dropped off small gifts, flowers, a card, a casserole, as if to apologize for not standing with her sooner. The backlash reached the state attorney general's office within days. An announcement followed. Oak Ridge HOA was under official investigation for discriminatory enforcement and excessive fines. The lien against Jessica's home was frozen, then swiftly dismissed. Harold tried to maintain control. He called an emergency meeting, railing about biased reporting and outsider interference. But his voice no longer carried the weight it once had. The same neighbors who once nodded in fearful agreement now pushed back, emboldened by the glare of publicity. The board, once his loyal chorus, fractured under the scrutiny. Jessica attended that meeting, not as a victim begging for mercy, but as a witness to Harold's unraveling. She watched him sputter, red-faced, as questions rained down. Why were certain homes fined while others ignored? Why had penalties reached thousands without warning or mediation? Why had personal grievances been disguised as community standards? For every question, Harold had only bluster. His empire of authority, built on intimidation and silence, crumbled in the light of exposure. A month later, Harold resigned. No speech, no apology, just a brief notice slipped under doors announcing his departure for personal reasons. Jessica thought she might feel triumphant, but the emotion that washed over her was relief. For the first time in months, she could breathe without fear of another envelope appearing in her mailbox like a curse. Yet her journey didn't end there. At the urging of neighbors, she agreed to run for a seat on the HOA board. The idea frightened her at first. After all, she had seen how power could corrupt. But the alternative, leaving the board to be filled by people like Harold, felt worse. Election day arrived in the community hall where she had once stood alone against Harold's scorn. This time, she wasn't alone. Ethan and Lily sat in the front row, eyes shining. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her hand before the results were read. And when Jessica's name was announced as the clear winner, applause erupted, echoing off the walls like thunder. Her first meeting as a board member felt surreal. She sat at the head table where Harold once sneered, her nameplate gleaming under the lights. When the gavel struck wood, signaling the start of business, she looked out at her neighbors and saw not adversaries, but a community ready to heal. She spoke simply, without theatrics. The HOA should exist to support, not to punish. We will enforce rules fairly, and we will listen before we fine. This board will never again be a weapon. The room erupted with cheers. That night, after tucking her children into bed, Jessica sat on her porch. The yard was trimmed, the grass neat, but she no longer saw it as a battlefield. She saw it as hers, earned, defended, secure. The hum of crickets filled the silence, steady and peaceful. Ethan joined her briefly, settling beside her with the quiet wisdom of a child who had seen too much too soon. "You didn't just win, Mom," he said softly. "You changed everything." Jessica wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. "We did it together," she whispered. The war Harold had started was over. The scars remained, but so did the strength she had discovered in herself. And though she knew life would throw more battles her way, Jessica also knew this: she would never again bow to unfairness. The HOA had tried to take her home, her peace, her dignity. Instead, they had awakened her resolve. And that resolve was unshakable.